to our next speaker, Taza Schaming, from PhD candidate at Cornell University.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. As some of you all know, I have been working on investigating the interaction between Clark's nutcrackers and whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem since 2009. And as most of you should know, whitebark pine is an obligate mutualist of Clark's nutcrackers because Clark's nutcrackers are the primary means of regeneration for the seeds. Most of the seeds grow from Clark's nutcracker seed caches. And right now, whitebark pine is declining, and there are lots of folks who are putting lots of time and effort and money into restoring whitebark pine. But when it comes down to it, we need to be sure that Clark's nutcrackers are available to continue dispersing seeds into the future. And one of the problems with this is that we don't really have a good understanding of how the decline of not only whitebark pine, but other five-needle pines and other conifer habitats is impacting Clark's nutcrackers. We don't really know how this habitat loss is impacting the population of the birds, both range-wide and local locations, how it's impacting their behavior or their life history. But the problem is that previous studies have suggested that the decline of whitebark pine is leading to lower local nutcracker populations. And if this is true, then that would mean that there are fewer nutcrackers available to disperse whitebark pine seeds, and that would just lead to a downward decline, which could really have cascading effects in the ecosystem.
Just a second. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And so for my PhD research, which I started in 2009, I actually just finished last month. I just defended and finished, which is super exciting. But for the past 8 years, I've been looking at how stable and resilient the keystone mutualism is, specifically in the greater Yellowstone. And this means I've been looking at how nutcracker demography and population and behavior is associated with habitat type, quality, and abundance specifically. I've focused on 6 main aspects of nutcracker life history: breeding ecology and reproductive success, home range size, seasonal habitat selection, seasonal habitat use, foraging ecology, and emigration dispersal behavior. This is a lot of work, and this has probably led to more questions than answers, but I'll share some of the answers with you. Along with looking at the life history and behavior, I've also really focused on the applied aspect, where one of my primary goals is not only to collect this data and understand Clark's nutcrackers, but to suggest management strategies that might help promote stability and resilience. So, since 2009, I've been working throughout the entire greater Yellowstone. This is a map of Wyoming, and my study area is outlined in black. I've been working in Bridger Teton National Forest, Shoshone National Forest, and Grand Teton National Park primarily. I've conducted occupancy surveys throughout all of those areas, but I've focused most of my trapping and radio tracking northeast of Jackson. So I've trapped 187 nutcrackers. Over 3 years, I've radio tracked 76 of those birds. So we followed individuals around and figured out who they were with, what they were doing, what they were eating, what habitats they were using. And then we conducted over 3,000 10-minute occupancy surveys at 238 random points over the years, a number of fledgling surveys. And then since 2014, I've been satellite tracking 7 nutcrackers. So for this talk, given the time limit, I'm just going to highlight some of the results from this research and ones that I think are most directly applicable to management. So first, when it comes to breeding ecology and reproductive success, this is obviously important because the fitness of individuals directly impacts the fitness of populations. And one of the most surprising results I found, which I actually discussed 2 years ago at this meeting, was that in 2 of the first 5 years of my research, non-breeding occurred population-wide. And just back up for a second, I'm not including most of the methods or field methods or statistical methods that led to some of these results, so please ask me afterwards if you have more questions. But based on the intensive radio tracking, based on the number of nests that we found, and based on seeing juveniles in the ecosystem, which are really noticeable when you're out there during the springtime in whitebark habitat and other nutcracker habitats. We found that in 2 years, nutcrackers did not seem to breed at all throughout the entire southern Greater Yellowstone. And what was interesting about this is that those 2 years, 2009, 2011, followed low whitebark pine cone crops. We actually have really great data in this area from the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team of cone crop levels throughout the entire area, stretching back to the 80s. And so it's only a small sample size of 5 years. This is correlation, not causation. But if it is these low whitebark pine cone crops that is leading to non-breeding, this is something that we really need to take into account when it comes to management strategies. Because if there's an increasing number of low whitebark pine cone crops and this leads to fewer breeding years, this could really have population level consequences on the birds. Another piece I found when it comes to fledging success is that fledging success seems to be closely correlated with a few habitat variables. When I first set out to look at the fledging success and what the associations were, I came up with my number of hypotheses. But then I also did a classification tree where I included all sorts of habitat variables because I realized we know so little about nutcracker reproduction and breeding ecology that I didn't want to miss any important habitat variables. And I found that most of them overlapped. What I predicted to be important was what was important. And so I included all the important variables from both my hypotheses and from the classification tree into a mixed model, 16 mixed models. And I found that the most important effects were the amount of whitebark pine within 101 hectares. That's the average breeding season home range size. I found that as the amount of whitebark pine within that 100 hectares increased, the likelihood of fledging increased, which is interesting because we don't necessarily think of whitebark pine being important during the breeding season. We think of it as being important during the fall harvest season. I also found that when there were more dead trees, specifically the percent of habitat within 50 meters composed of dead trees, when there were more dead whitebark pine trees surrounding the nest, the likelihood of fledging drastically declined pretty quickly. And then as the amount of Douglas fir within that 100 hectares increased, the likelihood of fledging declined. This was interesting because, as I'll show you later, we found that Douglas fir seemed to be a really important food source during the late winter and into the breeding season. So key points, lots of whitebark pine and only a small amount of Douglas fir seems to be optimal. And high whitebark pine mortality surrounding the nest seems to counteract the benefits of nesting in the landscape with whitebark pine. Next, looking at home range size. We all know that a home range size is important to understand because that really directs the scale at which management is carried out. And this was pretty interesting. I found that, so first I analyzed all the breeding season data because, once again, the breeding season is such an important part of an animal's life history. And I found that for breeding birds, their average home range size was about 100 hectares. For non-breeding birds during the breeding season, it was about 200 hectares. And in fact, for all breeding and non-breeding birds, throughout the entire pre-harvest season, before they started harvesting whitebark pines, they used about 200 hectares. This is based on radio tracking data. And then throughout the entire year, based on the radio tracking data, the birds used about 340 hectares minimum. I say minimum because we often weren't able to get to some of the further locations. We could pick up the bird's signal from where we were, but we often weren't able to get to the birds. We know they were using more area than is included in this. This is a little bit less than what Teresa Lorenz found in the Cascade. She found that birds were using about 1,300 hectares for their home range, and that's once again based on radio tracking studies. What I found really interesting was that when I evaluated the home range of the 7 satellite tagged birds during the time period outside, for the first year outside of the whitebark pine harvest season, so only when they were not harvesting whitebark pine seeds would we would expect them to move really far from their normal home range. Outside of that whitebark pine harvest season, these birds were moving, while they were in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, before they left the area, they were moving about over 17,440 hectares. These birds were moving huge distances. Now, when we were radio tracking, we could pick up the bird's line of sight about 30 miles. But the problem is often when a bird disappeared and you couldn't pick it up, you wouldn't know if it was just on the other side of the mountain that you were on, if it was in the next mountain range over, or if it had flown all the way to Canada. What I found is that while the birds were in the Greater Yellowstone still, before they left, several of them left, I'll talk about that later, they were often traveling really, really far. And what's also interesting is that they were traveling really far to whitebark pine habitats, to Douglas fir habitats, to other conifer habitats, and they were doing it every month of the year. It wasn't just while they were out seeming to look for potential harvest stands during the pre-harvest season. So nutcrackers seem to use an extensive area. One of the caveats is that this is just over 1 year and it's only 7 birds, so it's a pretty small sample size. We don't know if this huge area that these 7 birds were using it would be different in different years or in different quality habitats. So next, looking at habitat selection. Habitat selection is the actual behavioral process by which individuals choose certain habitats to use from what is available. It's not just where they are, but it's what they're actually choosing from what's available. And this, once again, shows a little bit different results depending on which group of birds and which time of the year we're looking at. But I found that if you look at the breeding season non-breeders, all of the birds in 2011, none of which bred, they seem to disproportionately highly select Douglas fir. And that's the only species, the only habitat that they're disproportionately highly selecting. We found the same thing for the breeders in 2012. So during the breeding season, these birds were highly selecting Douglas fir. And then when you just look at all the birds lumped together from 2011 and 2012, both a breeding and non-breeding year, all the way up until they start harvesting whitebark pine, once again, on average, they were all disproportionately highly selecting Douglas fir habitats. There was also variable selection of limber pine and moderate high mortality whitebark pine during this time. And then if I looked at the 7 satellite tagged birds for the entire year, other than the harvest season, I found they actually were not disproportionately highly selecting any habitats, though some of the birds were preferring limber pine over anything else. So it seems like, once again, is this different because it's different years? Is it different because it's different groups of birds? Or is it because of the way we sampled? Is it because of the radio tracking versus satellite tracking? I think it would be really beneficial to satellite track a lot more birds to see what habitat these birds are actually preferring. Is it limber and Douglas that's this important? But either way, what seems to be optimal is a habitat mosaic, which includes whitebark pine and Douglas fir and limber pine. Just to clarify, that was when I was looking at habitat selection of the home range within the available habitat. And when I say within available habitat, that was the habitat that was within 32.5 kilometers, which is the distance that Teresa Lorenz found that Clarkson nutcrackers were traveling from their summer home range to go harvest seeds, which they would bring back to that home range. When I instead looked at habitat selection of locations within the home range, I found that the birds were only selecting Douglas fir habitats when I looked at the pre-harvest season of the radio tracked birds. And instead, they were, even outside of the whitebark pine harvest season, they were selecting whitebark pine high mortality stands, both the radio tracked birds and the satellite tagged birds. But individuals were also highly selecting limber pine and Douglas fir habitats. So once again, this just seems to show that it's not just whitebark pine that we should be concentrating on when we're trying to restore whitebark pine stands. I think it suggests that we really need to look at the alternative nutcracker habitats that are adjacent or locally available near these whitebark pine stands. It's not, we shouldn't be managing whitebark pine in isolation. So along with using the radio tracking data to look at habitat selection, I also used occupancy survey data to look at habitat use. And use is not a choice, it's instead the observed pattern, which may be driven by external constraints such as competition. And for these occupancy models, for looking at habitat use, I was evaluating which resources were the most important drivers of occurrence. And one of my primary questions was looking at which scale of whitebark pine was impacting nutcracker occurrence. I also included Douglas fir because it seemed to be so important when it came to habitat selection. And I looked at whitebark pine cone crop, both presence, absence, and density. Whitebark pine trees, whether their presence, absence, or what the density was at a local scale, and then I looked at the abundance of whitebark pine on a landscape scale. Same variables for Douglas fir minus the cone crop. I also included detection, and looked at detection versus tree density and local whitebark pine. And detection is really important to include because it really allows you to get at whether or not when you don't see a bird, whether or not they're not there, or whether or not they're there and you're just not seeing them. One of the interesting pieces that came out of this, and I should say this is Schaming in Sutherland in review. I collaborated with a statistician who did the Bayesian analyses for this. One of the interesting things that I found is that detection was not associated with any of the variables that I included, but it did change over the year. And if you're not accounting for detection, the results of the occupancy were quite different. And what I found, which is different than the previous studies from McKinney et al. And Berenger et al., is that the density of cone crop did not seem to really influence the probability of occurrence. What's not showing up here is the variability. I found that there's a pretty high probability of occurrence regardless of the cone crop, which is the solid line. But if there were no cones present at all, which is the dotted line on the left-hand side, there was a much lower probability of occurrence. So it seems that at least in areas such as the Greater Yellowstone, where there is a lot of whitebark pine and a lot of nutcrackers, we should potentially be just managing for cone-bearing trees, not necessarily density of cone-bearing trees. We may not need to be worrying about this threshold of 1,000 cones per hectare, at least in some habitats, which I think changes a lot of the management plans. And also, it seems to be, once the landscape scale amount of whitebark pine seemed to be the most important variable again and again, suggesting that we should be really managing whitebark pine at this landscape scale and not at a local stand scale. I also found that outside of the fall harvest, the late summer when they're eating mature seeds and the fall harvest season, Douglas fir had a variable impact. During the post-harvest season, which is on the right-hand side, the more Douglas fir, the more likely the higher the probability of occurrence of Clark's nutcrackers. Alternatively, in the breeding season, as the area of Douglas fir increased, there was a much lower probability of occurrence. So this seems to suggest that this habitat mosaic with whitebark pine and a low abundance of Douglas fir may be optimal. And it also just shows that preference and prevalence, the habitat selection used, really yields different conclusions. Quickly, foraging behavior, because foraging behavior is obviously important to our understanding of what a species needs. I'm just going to highlight the fact that Douglas fir was incredibly important during the winter, and then seeds retrieved from caches seemed to not be very important at all. And I don't know if this is because in this area the birds are not depending on these seeds because they have so many alternative food sources, or if this is an artifact of these 2 years. We did follow these birds really intensively, so it's unlikely that we just weren't seeing the caches. We were seeing lots of caches and lots of birds caching, both banded and unbanded. Also of note is that more invertebrates in the diet was not correlated with increased breeding, which is something that a lot of birders found really surprising. And I'm going to skip that. And then lastly, when I look at emigration or dispersal behavior, this is important to look at because understanding really helps evaluate population viability in a region as a function of habitat. And it helps to determine the scale at which to focus at management efforts. A lot of management is carried out at the local scale, of course. I found that in 2015, the year when I was satellite tracking, of those 7 birds, 71% left the area. 4 of them actually went to Utah, overwintered in Utah. 3 of them came back to Jackson in June. 1 of them went up to Montana. So these birds are moving over a considerable distance. They also left in a year of a moderate cone crop. One of the most important points here is that these birds seem to leave during the whitebark pine cone harvest. They were leaving in August and September. And when they left, they flew to pinyon pine habitat, to ponderosa habitat, to Douglas fir habitat. They don't seem to have a high fidelity to whitebark pine. This just suggests that we should really focus on the metapopulation stability and resilience, not necessarily just the stability and resilience at a local level. And I'm out of time, but overall, my broad recommendations really are just that we should really be looking at nutcrackers over this broad range-wide scale. I think the local population is really affected by what's going on at the larger scale. And if we don't understand what's going on with these birds in, say, Utah and Montana, we don't necessarily know what's going on with them in the Greater Yellowstone because the same birds are moving over the landscape. So, And my last slide was acknowledgements, but I think I turned it off. Okay, I'm done.